the autumn of 1774, long before anyone could imagine a president of the United States, a group of men gathered in Philadelphia and improvised a government. They did not call it that, not yet. They called it a Congress, a meeting of colonies that still, at least officially, claimed loyalty to George III. They were petitioners, not revolutionaries, or so they told themselves. Inside the long, echoing hall where they met, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and unease. No one knew whether this gathering would end in reconciliation, arrest warrants, or something no one had words for yet. At the front of the room, in a chair that had no constitutional definition but immense symbolic weight, sat a lawyer from Virginia with a grave face and a body already beginning to fail him. His name was Peyton Randolph, and for a few tense weeks, he was as close as the colonies had to a head of state. He did not look like a revolutionary. Born in 1721 into one of Virginia's older planter families, Randolph grew up in a world that prized continuity, hierarchy, and the smooth management of appearances. His relatives had been in the colony for generations. The Randolph name carried weight along the James River and in the corridors of Williamsburg. The family owned land and enslaved people, lived off tobacco and political influence. As a young man, Peyton was sent to be educated in England, studying law at the Inner Temple. That training did more than teach him technical skills. It immersed him in the culture of British constitutionalism. The idea, treasured by Whigs on both sides of the Atlantic, that liberty depended on balanced powers, on precedent, on the dignity of Parliament. Returning to Virginia, he slipped easily into public life. He served as Attorney General of the colony and later as Speaker of the House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature. These roles required poise more than fire. The Speaker, especially, had to navigate between the governor's demands and the delegates' grievances to keep tempers from boiling over in a society where everyone believed in honor and almost everyone had a pistol. Randolph's temperament suited the part. He was cautious, conservative in temperament, if not always in politics, inclined to protect procedure as a way of holding chaos at bay. It's important to see that caution clearly. The mythology of American independence likes clean lines, patriots and loyalists, radicals and Tories. Randolph inhabited a murkier middle ground, at least early on. He was no friend of arbitrary authority. He opposed taxes imposed without representation and objected to Parliament's attempts to discipline the colonies. But he was also no instinctive rebel. He hoped for longer than some of his compatriots that London could be made to listen and that the old imperial relationship could be salvaged if only the king and ministers would recognize colonial rights as Englishmen. The crisis of the early 1770s wore that hope down. The Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, the Boston Massacre, and finally the coercive acts, what the colonists called the intolerable acts, piled insult and threat on top of one another. In response, the Virginia Burgesses passed resolutions, organized boycotts, and saw their assembly dissolved by the royal governor. They regrouped in unofficial conventions, maintaining a shadow government. When the idea arose for a General Congress of Colonies to coordinate resistance, it made sense that Virginia would send its speaker, the man who embodied their legislative dignity, to chair the gathering. So Peyton Randolph rode north to Philadelphia in late summer 1774, joining delegates from 12 colonies. Georgia stayed away at first, torn between fear of British power and dependence on imperial protection against native nations. The men who converged on Carpenter's Hall were a mixture of lawyers, merchants, planters, and ministers. Some, like Samuel Adams, were already committed to a hard line. Others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still clung to the possibility of compromise. They agreed quickly on one thing: they needed someone to preside. The title president was chosen less as a claim to executive power than as a recognition of function. A president was, quite literally, the one who presided, who called the roll, recognized speakers, ruled on motions. In parliamentary culture, this was a crucial role. The chair could shape debates subtly by the order of business, by how generously he interpreted rules, by when he allowed tempers to vent, and when he pushed for a vote. But it was not, in theory, a role for bold personal initiatives. A good presiding officer was supposed to disappear into the process. Randolph was elected unanimously. That unanimity was both compliment and constraint. It signaled trust in his impartiality. He was a Virginian, a useful balance to the fiery men from Massachusetts, but not so tainted by radical reputation that moderates would balk. Once in the chair, he was expected to be a neutral frame, not a partisan voice. He did not draft the most famous documents of the Congress. Those tasks fell to men like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. He did not dominate the floor debates with stirring speeches. He watched, listened, and kept the machinery of the meeting moving. It may be tempting to dismiss that as mere housekeeping, but in that room, at that moment, housekeeping was a political act. There was no clear constitution for what they were doing. The colonies had never before acted jointly in such a sustained way. Every small procedural choice, who spoke first, whether to vote by colony or by head, how to handle disagreements, could have turned quarrels into fractures. It was Randolph's job to prevent those fractures from widening. He didn't do it alone. Others, like Adams, labored in committees and informal conversations to build consensus. Yet Randolph's steady hand at the front of the room mattered. In a sense, his greatest accomplishment was that his presidency produced no dramatic crisis. The First Continental Congress finished its work, issued its petitions and declarations, and dissolved, having kept the colonies together in a calming front. What then did he fail to do? From a later revolutionary perspective, one could say that Randolph did not push hard enough, that he never quite embraced the radical break that was already gestating in the minds of some colleagues. He supported non-importation agreements as economic pressure on Britain, but he did not advocate independence. He still spoke of rights within the empire, of reconciliation on just terms. When the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, this time in the shadow of bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, Randolph was again chosen as president, but his tenure was brief. Family matters and failing health called him back to Virginia. John Hancock took the chair and presided over the Congress during the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. In the popular memory, that association, Hancock and his flamboyant signature, eclipsed the quieter figure who had first warmed the chair. Had Randolph stayed, would he have signed? The question is unanswerable. He was not a loyalist in the end. He joined his colony's Revolutionary Convention and remained involved in Virginia politics until his death in 1775. But his instinct was always for moderation and order. The leap from demanding rights as Englishmen to renouncing the king altogether was a larger psychological step for him than for some others. He moved toward it cautiously, pulled along by events. It is also fair to ask, how much power did he or any president of Congress in those early years really have? The honest answer is less than later generations might imagine, but more than nothing. The Continental Congress was a single-chamber body combining legislative, diplomatic, and executive functions. It had no separate president in the modern sense, no chief magistrate. The president of Congress could sign official documents, correspond on behalf of the body, and preside over meetings, but he could not veto decisions, command armies, or appoint officials without the delegates' consent. His influence came from his control of procedure and his standing among his peers, not from constitutional prerogatives. Randolph understood these limits. He did not try to stretch the office beyond them. In that, he arguably left a pattern his successors would follow. The pre-Constitution presidents of Congress, whether under the Continental Congress or the Articles of Confederation, saw themselves as chairs, not executives. They managed correspondence, certified laws and treaties, sometimes acted as figureheads in diplomacy, but they did not govern. From one perspective, that was a problem. The young Confederation would soon suffer from the weakness and diffusion of its central authority. Under the Articles, Congress struggled to raise revenue, enforce treaties, or coordinate policy among jealous states. Later critics would look back and say that what the nation lacked was exactly what the Constitution later supplied: a single, energetic executive able to act in the name of the whole. From another perspective, though, Randolph's modest approach reflected a real constraint. The colonies had just rebelled against a king. They were in no mood to create another. Any hint that the presiding officer of Congress was trying to become a kind of American viceroy would have provoked resistance. In this sense, what Randolph did not do was as important as what he did. He did not attempt to personalize power. He did not turn the chair into a platform for self-promotion. He did not appeal over the heads of his colleagues to the public. In a culture that would later be fascinated with charismatic executive leadership, his invisibility is instructive. The first man to sit in something like a national executive seat behaved as if he were simply a servant of procedure. That restraint helped reassure suspicious colonists that this new experiment in joint action was not a plot to replace distant royal authority with a nearer despotism. It also reflected his own background. Randolph was steeped in the etiquette of the Virginia gentry, where overt ambition was frowned upon and influence was exercised through networks, not grandstanding. As Speaker of the House of Burgesses, he had learned to wield power indirectly, through control of the agenda and the tone of debate. Transplanted to Philadelphia, those habits served him again. He did not need or want the spotlight. The paradox of his legacy is that this very self-effacing style consigned him to the margins of later historical memory. School books mention Washington, Adams, Jefferson. They rarely mention Peyton Randolph. When popular culture plays with the idea of the first president, it sometimes elevates John Hanson, who held the presidency of Congress later under the Articles, as a kind of proto-George Washington. That myth has more to do with 19th century romanticism than with actual power. If any man deserves the title of first presiding officer of a united colonial body, it is Randolph. But his quiet, procedural approach does not lend itself to easy hero stories. In a way, that makes him an interesting mirror for the presidency that would eventually emerge. The modern president of the United States is expected to be both head of government and head of state, both manager and symbol, both commander and consoler. We argue about their character, their speeches, their tweets, their sins. We read great weight into their decisions and non-decisions. But the office did not spring from nowhere. It grew out of bodies like the Continental Congress, where power was deliberately fragmented, and where the chair was a facilitator, not a ruler. Randolph's experience also underscores how much early American politics depended on men who were, in their own way, establishment figures. His family wealth came from land and enslaved labor. His education came from the imperial center. His instinct was to preserve as much of the old order as could be reconciled with colonial rights. The revolution was not led only by outsiders and firebrands. It was also led by lawyers who had once sworn allegiance to the crown and who, even as they broke with it, kept many of its forms. The title president itself, derived from an older parliamentary vocabulary, is part of that inheritance. If one looks closely, there are hints of strain in his last years. The weight of events was heavy. To sit in that chair in 1774-75 was to feel the gravitational pull of forces larger than any procedure. The anger of merchants, whose trade was strangled by British policy. The fear of farmers, who knew that open war would bring devastation. The ideological tug-of-war between those who wanted to proclaim rights and those who dreaded the consequences. Randolph's health, already fragile, did not improve under the load. He died in October 1775 back in Virginia before independence was declared. There is a kind of symmetry in that. The cautious lawyer who had presided over the first collective protests did not live to see the more radical step. How should we judge him? If the standard is visionary radicalism, he falls short. He did not articulate a new theory of republican government. He did not write phrases that ring down the centuries. If the standard is effective management in a moment of constitutional improvisation, his record looks different. He helped give institutional form to what could have been a chaotic meeting. He lent Virginia's prestige to the enterprise, bridging regional suspicions. He embodied, in his person and in his style, the early American fear of concentrated executive power, a fear that would shape the design of the presidency proper. The chain from Randolph to Washington is not a straight line, but it is there. When the framers in 1787 debated what to call the executive, president, rather than governor general or excellency, They reached for a term already familiar from Congress and from state governments. They imagined a figure who would preside over the execution of the laws, not a king. Of course, the office they created had far more power than the chair in Carpenter's Hall. The president, under the Constitution, could veto bills, command the army, make treaties with the Senate's consent. But the genealogy of the title carried a memory of modesty. Peyton Randolph, in that sense, is a kind of ghost at the founding feast. He reminds us that before there was a Washington crossing the Delaware, there was a man in a chair trying to keep 13 delegations from flying apart. Before there were presidents who embodied a nation, there were presiding officers who embodied a procedure. What he did was to keep the conversation going long enough for more decisive actors to emerge. What he did not do was seize that moment to magnify himself. As we move forward, from him to the succession of other presidents of Congress, and then to the familiar occupants of the constitutional presidency, it is worth carrying his shadow with us. It complicates the story of American leadership. The first president, if we stretch the term back before the Constitution, was not a general or a visionary writer. He was a colonial lawyer, cautious and courteous, who believed that order was precious and that power should walk quietly,